This semester, we read different literary works from different authors who cover different important aspects of argument. What I deduced from all of it is that argument is a form of discourse that involves the exchange of ideas, concepts, and understandings. There are different forms, approaches, and interpretations of what exactly an argument is. It doesn't have to be what we would generally believe argument to be, such as a heated exchange between a couple, although that is a type of argument. It could also involve people being persuaded or disagreements being resolved. Aristotle identified three different perspectives of argument: logical, dialectic, and rhetorical. Logical perspectives on argument are where a premise is introduced in support of a conclusion. The intention behind the logical argument is to convince others to agree with the statement or action called for in the conclusion. An example of this would be a politician talking about the dangers of old crumbling bridges in order to gain support for an infrastructure bill. The dialectic perspectives on arguments occur when the attention of the argument is focused on exchanges and dialogue. These type of arguments include negotiations and debates, and theorists who study these types of arguments are the ones who devise the rules that govern the correct procedures for how argument is to be conducted. And finally, the rhetorical perspective on arguments involve examining the communication between the arguer and their audience, where an understanding on the composition and beliefs of the audience is important to the arguer in the success of their argument. I believe the rhetorical form of argumentation is the most efficient method of argument and the one that best defines and embodies what argument is and seeks to do. I say rhetorical arguments best define argument because the goal of argument and discourse is to persuade or convince others that what you're saying or arguing for or against is warranted. To be able to do this, attention must be paid to who the audience is, as they are the group of persons the arguer is trying to persuade or convince with their argument. Rhetoric has its origins in ancient Greece and Rome. They consider rhetoric to be persuasion, but in the form of an art. Rhetorical argumentation revolves around the use or combination of the appeals Aristotle associated with rhetoric. The three appeals are ethos, pathos, and logos, which correlate to the arguer, the audience, and the argument itself. Ethos in terms of argumentation is where an appeal to character, mainly that of the speaker, is being made. Here, the speaker seeks to establish credibility and portray themselves as positive characters to the audience. Pathos in argumentation features the speaker attempting to appeal to the emotions of their audience. To do this, the speaker must have an understanding and knowledge of the cognitive environment of their audience, which is a set of facts believed by a group. The audience is the most important factor for a speaker when crafting an argument, as the nature of the audience, as well as what they believe and think, sets the terms of the premises put forward by the arguer. And then at last, there's logos. Logos is the argument itself, the logic. The argument logos is heavily reliant and determined by both the character and motives of the speaker, ethos, and the understanding of the nature, knowledge, and beliefs of the audience, pathos. A successful argument is one where the arguer presents themselves to be credible enough to speak on a topic and crafts their argument with an accurate depiction of their audience. Some of our assignments had us read about a particular aspect of argument and explain how authors successfully implemented that aspect into their literary or oral works. Over the summer, I, like almost everyone around the country and the world, had a lot of free time in my hands, so I decided to get back into reading books. One of the books I read was The War on Normal People by Andrew Yang. This, I believe, is one of the most important and timely books out right now, as it primarily focuses on the economy and how technology and artificial intelligence is and will impact the lives of millions. In his book, Andrew Yang, who ran for the Democratic nomination for president this year, argues that there is a growing need for the United States to begin distributing a universal basic income, which is a governmental program where adult citizens receive money on a regular basis to alleviate financial struggles and poverty. After learning all semester about what an argument is, I can say that Andrew Yang's book is a great example of what an argument is. Yang uses the rhetorical form of argument in his book, introducing the audience to the reality of the economy and the lives of those who hold some of the most common jobs in it, in order to convince them that a universal basic income is necessary. To immediately begin his book, An Argument, Yang makes an appeal to ethos, introducing his audience to who he is and why he has the credibility to speak on this issue. Yang states that he is an entrepreneur who started a business called Venture for America, which is a 2-year fellowship program for recent college graduates who want to create businesses and jobs around the country. He says he started this business because business and job creation have been continuously slowing and declining in America compared to the previous 12 years due to the advancement of technology. Yang states that while having lunch with some of his friends who work in the technology sector, they told him that the various companies they worked for were investing in and implementing technology and software that will replace large portions of their workforce. He is told by an investor friend of his that about 70% of new startup businesses he invested in will contribute to job loss in major sectors of the economy. Yang then writes that the Obama administration, who selected Yang as a, quote, champion of change, as well as recognizing him as a presidential ambassador for global entrepreneurship for his work with Venture for America, published a report in late 2016 after the election that predicted 83% of jobs paying less than $20 per hour will be subject to automation or replacement. So far, Yang has presented himself as someone with direct knowledge and information on what is happening and will happen to those who he terms, quote-unquote, normal people. He identifies normal people as the 70% of Americans who consider themselves part of the middle class. This is a group of people who hold jobs in sectors that are actively being outsourced overseas or replaced by a form of technology or artificial intelligence. They most likely didn't go to or finish college, only possess a high school diploma, live paycheck to paycheck, and has no or less than $500 in savings, with nothing invested in the stock market. Yang, throughout the book, makes an appeal to pathos, the audience, by sharing conversations he's had with normal people throughout the country, as well as by presenting more facts and statistical as well as historical data about the state of everyday jobs in these normal people's communities. He starts with the most common job in the country, office and clerical work. Yang brings up a study conducted by McKinsey that suggested between 64 and 69% of tasks performed by office workers can be automated, as well as 50% of customer service tasks. He says that in conversations he's had with people around the country, he would ask them if they would receive phone calls from numbers that resembled theirs only to answer and be greeted by a robot or automated call about their car insurance warranty or something along the likes. Yang notes that a technologist friend of his, who works for a major financial institution in San Francisco, told him that many of the people who inhabit the homeless shelter he volunteers at previously worked doing clerical tasks that no longer required humans to do. Something Yang alludes to throughout the book is that companies are beholden to and held accountable to their shareholders and will do whatever it takes to maximize profit, even at the expense of their dedicated employees. Robocalls are a great example of the outcome of that. He goes on to explain the state of retail jobs, the second most common job held in the country. Yang writes that 1 in 10 Americans work in retail and sales, a sector that is increasingly laying off workers due to the success of online retailers and the decline of anchor stores within malls. These would be the big department stores such as JCPenney's, Macy's, and Sears. He asked people in Michigan and Ohio if they noticed their local mom and pop stores or shopping malls were closing. And most times people would say yes. In 2017, with what is termed the retail apocalypse, retail stores began declaring bankruptcy or were at risk of defaulting. As anchor and popular stores began closing and cutting jobs, people stopped visiting their local malls more and more, which put 310 out of the country's 1,200 malls at risk of closing. Yang says that the decline of malls is directly correlated to the rise of e-commerce, a sector that at the time of the book's publishing, Amazon controlled over 43% of. The third most common job, Yang says, is in food service. These would be your restaurants and fast food spots. He notes that cooks, servers, and other related jobs within the industry are not at risk of being automated anytime soon, but jobs are being reduced nonetheless. Yang says that a venture capitalist friend of his was investing in a company that produced software that would create shifts and schedules for restaurant staff, which will reduce the need for multiple managers, specifically for shift managers. Notice touchscreen ordering stations in your local Wendy's or McDonald's? That's thanks to automation as well. Restaurants no longer need to hire or schedule as many cashiers as before, because now customers can just order their orders on their own. I can attest to this. I worked at my local Wendy's for 3 years during high school, And in my last year there, we put up touchscreen ordering stations and a self-serve Coca-Cola freestyle machine. Shortly after, maybe 3 weeks at most, my friend Ty, who usually manned the cash register during closing hours and prepared customer drinks, started getting reduced hours and eventually was let go because we no longer needed him. This is happening more rapidly around the country in most similar restaurants. Yang writes that between 50 and 70% of fast food sales take place in the drive-thru. He goes on to say that McDonald's began an initiative titled The Experience of the Future, which will replace drive-thru personnel in at least 2,500 of their locations with software. No longer will you have to worry about yelling into the speaker to tell your order to a person with a headset behind the screen. The next major job sector that Yang says will be reduced due to automation is truck driving. Yang, to my surprise, notes that truck driving is the most common job in 29 states. The rollout of self-driving cars and trucks has began all around the world. Yang says self-driving trucks have already completed successful trips in Nevada and in Colorado, and mega corporations such as Google and Tesla have already implemented self-driving capabilities in their vehicles. Companies around the delivery industry are investing in self-driving trucks because it's more cost and time efficient. Not only do companies have to pay drivers, but there are laws that limit the amount of time drivers can go without taking a break for rest. With self-driving trucks, outside of maintenance, you only pay for the technology at the time of purchase, and you don't have to worry about the technology needing to rest or needing to eat. Yang says that the decline in truck driving jobs would not only devastate the truck drivers themselves, but would also affect the motels that they stayed at, the restaurants that relied on them to stop in for a bite to eat at, and the gas and rest stations where they would refuel, stretch, or get snacks from. The entire book, The War on Normal People, was Andrew Yang making the argument that because there has been and will be a dramatic decline in the number of jobs most common in the country, it is not only logical, but critical that the United States adopt the universal basic income, which Yang nicknames the freedom dividend, that replaces a portion of the lost income many of these people will be facing. Yang says it's needed because in times of widespread economic crises, only the federal government has the power and capabilities to keep families and individuals from economic ruin. If anything has been apparent during the coronavirus pandemic, it has been that. If Andrew Yang were to go back and update his book, no doubt would he include the lack of economic response by the federal government during this pandemic as a further example of why the freedom dividend is needed. Aside from the use of statistics and data about declining jobs, Yang validates his call for UBI and curtails expected skepticism on its feasibility by including examples of countries and even states that have at some point implemented a universal cash payment program. Most notably, he mentions the state of Alaska, which through its Alaska Permanent Fund has issued a yearly dividend to their citizens for decades. Yang notes that while the Alaska dividend is funded by revenue generated from its mines, oil, and gas reserves, funding for the freedom dividend will come from a value-added tax on the largest tech companies who currently pay little to nothing in federal taxes. He then notes that the United States is one of the 33 countries in the world and the only developed nation, the only one, that does not have a value-added tax or a tax on goods and services. While skating off tax-free, large corporations like Google and Facebook accumulate vast amounts of profit off of user data. As Yang puts it, data is the oil of the 21st century, and we should all share in the gains made off of our data, especially when some of these corporations contributed to and are to be blamed for the loss of jobs in the first place. Argument does not hold a consensus definition. Its meaning has been debated and changed since the time of the sophists. To reiterate my view, based on the material we covered this semester, I would define argument as a form of discourse that involves the exchange of ideas, concepts, and understandings with the intent of persuading a defined audience of something. If Aristotle, Plato, or a New York City sophist were to ask me to point them to a good example of an argument, I would immediately implore them to pick up a copy of Andrew Yang's The War on Normal People.